Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit session. I'm actually going to be doing a presentation, and again, feel free to ask questions. And on this end, my kind of view is that I really believe that GenAI agents, and I'll explain a bit what I mean by that. They will dramatically change our industry for the better, by the way. So I want to explore that, and I will go into some of the topics where I think it will make a massive difference in there. So the first thing is that GenAI is a big deal. I know everybody talks about it. Everybody talk kind of, it's a lot of hype, and also there is a lot of hype, right? There is a lot of, it's a bit for some of you guys that have been around here for a while. You know that's what happens, right? Like the cloud had a lot of hype, the internet had a lot of hype, mobile had a lot of hype, but and there's parts of it that there's going to go up and bust. There's lots of investment on crazy stuff, but I think the fundamentals are there. And Max, one of the slides I don't have here, but I want to add is, it's a bit like we created Jarvis, if you know the analogy from Iron Man, which is, as you could see in the movies, is a great help, allows, Tony Stark to build all sorts of crazy stuff, right? But then it's almost like we launch it in the world by asking it to write some poetry or do some stuff, and then he hallucinates because it tries to help, and then we go into the feed. That's really bad. So I actually think hallucinations are something quite good, and I'll explain in a bit why that's the case. So this will bring a lot of change. They're very fast, but there's always this thing, right? Like, people get excited, some new things, and I think we're getting into the chasm bit now, because there's a lot of people that's interesting, but it's not for me. And there's also a lot of people that go, wait, what's going on? And some people go, well, I want my fax machine back, right? But there's always a lot of challenges here. So I really think we're now getting into this chasm bit, and you can see it. You can see that after the excitement, there's lots of, even a lot of very clever people, right? And a lot of people that have a lot of experience, and they really now, saying that it's not a big deal, it's not going to be as much as it is. And I think they're looking from the different angle. They probably are correct in the way they're looking at it, but I will argue that there's a different way of looking at this, which I think is very exciting. And just about everything will be impacted, right? And that's the bottom line. The same way that you can argue that internet and technology, but let's say the internet is now impacted just about every industry. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, right? But everything will be impacted. So one of the things I find interesting is this analogy of Gen AI with electricity. Because at the moment, everybody in a cybersecurity team, and the analogy here was why everybody in cybersecurity team needs to be, an AI user / expert. But I would argue that in other teams need to be the same thing. But what you have is, we take for granted that you want people to be an electricity expert, a power user, right? At least a computer power user, internet power user, email power user. But all this stuff, especially I would say email, didn't exist. After internet didn't exist, right? Even computers, right? For a while, they were not really the productivity tools that we have today, but we now take it for granted. So the difference is that these changes are happening at a much faster pace. But in a way, my hypothesis here is that I would say that everybody in the cybersecurity team needs to be an AI power user because of the force multiplier, because you will make their world, in fact, I would even argue their happiness in how they operate, a lot higher, because a lot of the frustrations that we have today, we now have a way to deal with it, and we can scale in ways that we could never before. So, the key here is when you look at everybody that will be impacted, it kind of falls into three gaps, right? And people should be excited. In fact, I think a lot of companies should be they should be very excited, and they should be panicking, because they really should be looking at it from a very effective way. But there's also a lot of people that are ignoring it and go, yeah, it's all right, we can live with it. And I think there's also lots of industries and companies and professions that in the past it was okay, right? In the past, it was okay because the incremental change that was coming was 10, 20%. It took a lot of years to do it. You could even ignore it, and then catch up later and still be okay. I think the rate of change is very different, and the acceleration that we have now is massively different. And I actually think that the sweet spot is you should be panicking because you should be understanding that you don't have a lot of time, but you should also be very excited because you should be able to really take your services or your tools or your products, or what you provide and where you add value, you can take it to the next level. In fact, you could even dramatically increase your market because you can now provide lots of great services to other markets that before you just couldn't, or it wasn't scalable to go there, right? And here's the killer thing, right? This is some of the companies that panicked in the last 2 years. And these are not small players like Microsoft, McKinsey, AWS, Google. They all realize that, in a way, the Gen AI, the AI world, is really going to make a massive difference in their companies. And they've made, in a way, a very good bet. So, you could argue that somebody's been doing this for a while, but it's, what could have happened was, you could argue that Microsoft didn't panic enough when the mobile came along, even when the cloud came along. And they missed the boat, right? They're catching up, right? They took a long time to be at a good place. And in the mobile, they completely lost it, right? Same thing with, in a way, if you look at AWS, for a while, they didn't really had a good AI strategy and good AI models, right? They use in some areas, but now they really bring it to the next level. They're kind of catching up because, again, they saw the opportunity. And Google is another massive one, although they were investing in it. The reality is that I would argue that AI can pose an existential threat to a lot of the Google stuff. Like, I dramatically reduce my Google usage. And when I use it now, it just feels primitive, and I hate it because it doesn't have context. Like I was doing this presentation when I did the first round, it was so frustrating to use Google Images because it just didn't understood, and I'd have no way to communicate my intent. So, a big deal, right? And now, if we talk about cybersecurity, here's the thing, right? In cybersecurity, in the world of cybersecurity, our industry is also part of the problem. Because a lot of the times, if you think about it, we live in the fringes, or part of our industry, of inefficiencies of other teams. So other teams have inefficiencies, or they don't have a certain amount of knowledge or skill, or, to be honest, not even their problem, is the model that they're in, where they're not given the time and the budget to do things in different ways, and sometimes better ways. So we kind of evolve to add value there. But the reality is that if you look at our industry, half of it or most of it is fucking broken, right? Like, it provides, you move the needle from a little bit to a little bit, right? Sometimes, some of the security products in here, some of these logos, they're more insecure than, some of the stuff that we have in our network. So some of them, you could argue that we have a negative risk score by putting them in a network, right? And it's just crazy how we have this massive industry where actually a lot of this, we should be looking at how we improve others. But I get why we had this, because there was lots of problems that it wouldn't scale otherwise. So in a way, market economics allowed the creation of all these industries and tools and companies that exist there. But a lot of it is freaking broken. So the thing I want to be very clear here, all the thing I'm talking about, and especially the AI opportunity, is not about the Terminator. That is a real problem, but it's not, it's not to be solved here, and it's not the world that we operate that needs to be solved. That needs to be solved at a different level, the same way that we are able to control nuclear weapons and other things. And yes, there's going to be problems, and we will need to do something about it, right? But this is not what that's about, right? What this is about, and it's also this is not about being fired, right? Look, companies that want to fire people, they're always going to fire people. They don't need Gen AI to do that. And basically, there is a change like exists in a lot of industries, the same way that we don't have professional typewriters anymore. We don't have people that drive, horses and carts, right? There's a lot of professions that have been, that evolved, that, yes, it might disappear, but that's not I don't think that's the world that we're getting, in the short term here, right? What it's all about is about scaling and making the human better with the agents. And at the end of the day, like, look, stupid people will do stupid things, right? Like, if you're a lawyer and you use ChatGPT to help on a case, right, and you don't check the references, especially knowing the thing hallucinates, dude, you almost deserve it, right? And like these guys here, right? And if you do like that as a thought experiment, maybe there's a bit of a Darwin Award here going on. So again, we don't control that, but what's important is to understand the concepts. So I want to walk you through a little bit my thought process and why it really, the paradigm shift that really made me think about how all this works, right? So the GPT thing is actually worth spending the time. Over the summer, I took 30 books on my holiday. We drove to where we went so I could take it. But when I really went deep, but I thought the more I went deep, the more I realized that this sort of the GPT concepts really hit me, and I really got a good understanding, because I think each word is very important. The generative, the fact that it creates something, there's an air gap, and I'll talk a bit. The fact that we pre-train it and we train it almost in a particular direction, I think that's very important. And then the transformer, which is fundamentally how you map the connections, how you're able to provide context between the words or images. And I'll show a great image that was for me the big paradigm shift. So when you look at the generative, this is the bit that really I start to understand the power of this, which is the way I think about the generative is that you have an input, you have an intermediate representation, and then you have an output. By the way, the reason the images here suck is because I've seen images in the past and I was trying to find them and I couldn't find them. So this is kind of the best I could find when I was building this, right? Definitely needs improvement. But to be honest, it's the generative workflow, but it's literally, you got an input, you got an intermediate representation of that input, and then what will become really good is creating really good transformations out of that one. So not transformation, but a word, equivalent, outputs from that are now good enough or are as good as the input, and then we become good at connecting some of those dots, right? But the really important thing is that intermediate representation. And the other key concept here, and this is for me was the killer interesting feature here, is that the cost of creating a new output is actually linear, right? So that means if it costs A or costs X to do one version, it's going to cost 2X to do 2 and 3, 4, is the same minimal cost, and is actually quite a low cost to create that other data. And it also means that whatever output you have is just one of millions, billions of what could happen based in a way of your prompts or some of your inputs. And again, that's a game changer, which I'll go in a bit. The transformer is also one of those things that the more I looked at it, the more it clicked. And the more you kind of start to realize that that's how it works. And it's interesting because now when I use ChatGPT quite advancedly, I can see it in action. I can see how it operates. In fact, I now can understand the clues that I need to give it because of the transformer. And the fundamental of the transformer, and this was, I think, the big sort of paradigm shift, is that as the words come along, each word, it gets assigned a particular set of weighting depending on almost the context of the other words. And almost like finding a way to provide attention to say what is really important here. So you start to understand, or the logic as it builds, you start to understand the difference in context of what's happening. And that's massive. So I kind of view the transformer as a way to almost think, pay attention here, pay attention there, this is relevant, that is relevant. And then it's like a massive graph that it goes along. And I saw this great paper recently from the Anthropic guys, who actually are the ones behind Claude 2, which is another really good basically model. And they were basically trying to understand how it works. And this is the killer thing, right? Remember that up until now, we still don't have a good understanding exactly how the large language model works, exactly how Claude 2 works, how ChatGPT works. It's one of those engineering problems that we haven't solved, and which is crazy if you think about it, because there's so many layers and you don't connect. And one of the things these guys looked at is basically saying, if we look at the neurons individually, they couldn't find a connection between the neurons that fire, that were activated based on the input. But what they've done was they created a bunch of clusters, a bunch of what they call features, which are basically certain groups of neurons in a certain way. And once they've done that, then they start to get a one-to-one mapping between, for example, English inputs, and the output, or Korean, or maths, or DNA sequence, etc. And even cooler, they found that if they take a particular, say, numbers, which produce numbers at the end, but they start to modify the activation elements, that basically the neurons who basically tend to be activated, so they over stimulate those, you get the results in whatever you wanted. So suddenly you go from numbers to Korean, to English, to DNA sequences, to whatever, HTML, etc. So that was a really cool example, which actually raises some interesting security concerns, by the way, the more we evolve into this and how models can be manipulated. But again, great research. And this is all about the transformer. And there's some really freaking cool visualizations if you follow the real paper about this. Now, this is the image that made me understand ChatGPT and made me understand GenAI and made me realize we're now into something massive. And let me walk you through this picture. The square in the middle, the rectangle in the middle, is the original picture. So that's the original painting. The big picture is, in a way, Adobe Firefly created a large format of that based on the initial image. But you could see how it flows, right? You could see the sun there, having this flow. You can see this window part here. You can see the town being bigger. You can see the difference in colors. That makes sense. And when I saw these images, I had a big paradigm shift, because although it was image, and now you can apply the same thing to text, but I start to realize that this is something that you can't Photoshop this, right? You can't do Illustrator. You can't create this almost from scratch unless you understand the art, unless you can replicate the artist format in the beginning. I say, unless you can understand almost the context and the language and the intent of the original painting. And that's massive. And then if you connect this to the fact that the cost of creating the outer edge, another version, is the same as to create this version. And this is where now you become an art director. This is where you start to look at the intent. So you can argue and say, actually, I don't want a town on the left. Actually, I don't want that big sun to be there. Actually, that moon represents something else. I want something going on. Like you now can art direct this, and you can make changes based on the prompts. And the cost of creating a new one is the same cost of creating this. And that is a massive, change, because usually what happens is that, even when you take things like threat modeling and other things that we do, and documentation and mappings and languages and even stories, you do a great first version, but then tweaking it is where you spend a lot of time. So this allows us, this generative mode allows us to now be very productive in the customization, in the improvement of the final thing. But it is very important. Somebody, an artist, still has to validate the final finding. There's still a creative process to say, yes, that conveys the meaning that I wanted. That conveys the original stuff that, well represented. So, for example, here you got Mona Lisa on the left, and then you got Nirvana, and you can go Adele in here, and you get, for example, a joke on the right, where you go, oh, look, I can put the Metallica Master of Puppets in a cake, right? So, but you see, that shows again the power of this, where you can now go, I don't want that lake on the left, I don't want something on the right, I don't want a shark in the Nirvana thing over here. Adele actually shouldn't be smoking something, or whatever that, something else, or she should not be in a table. Like literally, you can now think about, what do you want the message and the creation to be. But this is the power of the generative, where the middle bit now can be manipulated and translated and talked to, to create the output. So you can turn around to the right and say, well, I don't want that to be a cake. And that's fine. You get another version. Oh, I want that to be something else. I want that to be these fields. I want that to be a war zone. I want that to be whatever you want it to be, right? And that's insanely powerful. So that was the one that really made me think of the power of the generative. And then when I apply that to risk, when I apply that to our industry, I see insane parallels that you got. So fundamentally, what you have is this. You got an input, you got an intermediate representation, and you get the output. And that intermediate representation is fundamentally what GenAI is creating, is all those layers that exist. And the reason we don't fully understand it is because at the moment we still don't understand how a lot of the relationships between those layers occur in the large language models. But this is insanely powerful, because based on the inputs, that you can provide, you can now control the quality and the directions of the output. And it's very easy to create new versions of this, which is super powerful. So fundamentally, the view where I say GenAI can add a lot of value is in managing complexity. So we are now able to tackle issues that before was just too complex. And that's insane, because in a way, how do we scale this? That's just in fact, that's a simplified version of everything that, the CISO, needs to care about from a security point of view. And this is even missing things that happened recently, right? Again, the services, on the left is an example of services that I created, right, in one of the teams I led. And we had to provide all those kind of services to basically help the business. But how do we scale this? And in a way, let me now give you some examples quickly on some of the areas where if you apply this concept of GenAI, we will have a massive impact in the scalability. So the first one is communication. We have a massive challenge in security of communicating. It's not just with board members, it's with execs, even within ourselves, with other teams. And the problem with communication is scale. You can sit down and take a particular risk, a particular vulnerability, a particular finding, and if you have enough skills or understanding of the problem, you can write that for a particular audience. And if you do that, you're quite successful. The problem is that in security, we have literally every part of the business is our stakeholder. So we need to have messages that goes all the way from pure financial to communications to customer focus to pure technical to strategic to whatever, right? So the bit that I never could see how we could scale was how we could figure out how to communicate to a target audience. And fundamentally, before ChatGPT, right, the idea, like if I ask some, and I try to ask my teams, but of course that it could never have worked, right? Because the idea is that we have a message and we will go, okay, so we need to take that message and we need to give it for that particular person or that particular team in their particular language, in their particular culture, in a way, in the particular state of understanding that they've got, right? That is ridiculous, right? Because the engineering cost and the ability to do that will be too greater. And then you have 20 of those stakeholders or 10 of those or 50 stakeholders, where each one of those really needs, a consistent message, but it needs to be translated in, like I said, in their language, in their culture, in their understanding, in their skill set, in their background, and all that. But now we can't, because in practical terms, you can have a prompt, and I'll show some examples in a bit. We have a prompt, say, hey, you are an advisor. Here is the communication I want to give. Now, explain this to a particular audience. And then guess what? ChatGPT or whatever what you're using is able to do that. And ironically, that's what they're really good at. So hallucinations, I think, is a good thing because they really show that the limitations of what it's supposed to be doing, and it shows that we shouldn't be taking some of the outputs at face value. But the point here is that what it allows you to do is allows you to take a professional and say, I want to communicate this, and this is my intent, and then allows ChatGPT to go, cool, what about this? And then you read it and you're going, yeah, that's what I want to say. Sometimes you may go, that's even better way of saying what I want to say than I was able to do. But it's still you validating. It's still you basically saying, this is my idea, or this is what I want to say. Is this that is now translated in all sorts of different languages and cultures, which I think is insanely powerful. So I think communication is an area that is going to make a crazy difference, right? And if you want to see a good example of communication failure today is risk. So for the first time, we have the ability to scale our risks, or the ability to create risks, ability to scale the creation of risk, scale the mapping of risk, scale the connection of risks, and scale the explanation and the risk acceptance. And before now, all of these required, in a way, insane amount of engineering, insane amount of graphs, and even then it wouldn't really work. Now, when you add to the mix the ability to take a message and transform that message based on a particular set of rules and intent and requirements and data sources, and that can be translated into, again, different languages, different cultures, different experiences, different analogies, different, and also, but this is really, really important, and different context of understanding. So it means you take into account where the other person is in their knowledge, and you continue from there, which is always the best way to teach, the best way to communicate, because you're providing information that's almost like 100% relevant to that particular individual. We can now do this. So imagine if you're talking to a board members, you can now create customized messages to each one. Why is it important? How does it relate to, an MBA? Okay, here's the risk data from a point of view of an MBA. CFO, here's the risk point of view. CFO, chief people officer, here's the same risk from the point of view of people. In the past, we tried to do this, but it couldn't really scale. Now we can, but you can keep going down. You can go and, to the execs, and then to the teams, and then the project managers, and even to the developers. You can have almost like the same risk explained completely vertical on the whole organization. And you can then say, hey, engineer, you need to do X, Y, Z. Here's why. And here's why it matters in a way that it makes sense to you, that it connects with a wider, even business direction, objective, and risk to the business. So we can now create all these translations that, in a way, the risk is still the same, or the model is still the same, but the views of it are all different. And that's massive. So I think for the first time, we're going to be able to really do something I've been trying to do, and I've done to some extent, but it's really hard. But I feel now much more possible, which is to have a direct connection between the top level risk of the company and the risks that the individuals that are doing something about it actually are aware of. And there's a connection behind, all the way in a graph, but also in context all the way there. And this is super critical. So that means that somebody, for example, in the cybersecurity team or an engineering team that's doing something, they should know exactly what risks they're mitigating, and maybe even what risks they're creating. And then when we go to the program owners, we do the same thing. So this is a really great way to scale. And if you want to do another area where it really, it's not being effective today, is third-party vendor management. And part of the reason is because even if you have a good, mature process, and even if you tweak a little bit, it's still spreadsheet driven. It's still very non-context specific. So, because even if you get mature, have tons of questions, tons of things, and maybe you've been tweaking a little bit, that's nowhere where we need to be. Because what we need to do is, this is a good example of bots. And again, take into account that these days you can already have private bots, private LLMs that run in your cloud environments, run in your data center. So the idea of data leakage and influencing models, we kind of passed that, which is great. And also in a lot of these things, we don't really need to tweak the model itself. What we need to do is add good information for the model to understand. So if you imagine here, you can say, all right, you are a third-party vendor management bot. Here is our current vendor management policy and structures and questions, and this is what we need to know. Here's why we need to know that. That's quite important. So then there's consistency. And now here's a particular vendor. Now, for example, we can even say to the bot, okay, start asking questions. And ChatGPT can already do this, by the way. And you can say, hey, have a conversation with these third parties. So now the bot can start asking questions to the third party, can be given information, and then he can provide guidance to the third party. Okay, so you need to implement this. You care about this, you don't care about that. Yes, based on your team size, you can do internally. Actually, there's no way with your current team size you can do it. So you need to find a vendor, for example, that'll give you this. You can even create a brief. Oh, here's a brief for your vendor. So you can see that we can now take a lot more ownership on helping our third parties, which, by the way, is part of our supply chain. So, they're a critical part of your infrastructure from a security point of view. But we can not only be able to evaluate them better, be able to make better security decisions, especially in the procurement stage, but also we can, help for the vendor that we're working on. We can help to make them more secure. We can help to raise the bar at their end. And actually, we done a lot of cost for us because we just implement the bots, implement the agents. And this is kind of what I mean by the agents, which is these bots that act, on behalf, and you have multiple agents working together. Documentation, which is one of those things that got thrown, away in the last 10, 15 years as we gained speed. And yes, there's an argument to be said that in the past it was probably a bit over the top. Again, it didn't really scale and it was quite costly, but we kind of went to a mode where not everybody does it, but a lot of teams go, oh, the documentation is the code, and we are agile. We don't do documentation, and we don't have diagrams, and we, our system is not, we can't stop to draw the whole thing and how it works, which is ridiculous, right? Because if you think about it, they want it. It's just that they don't have the time. So it's not that if you go to a team and say, hey, you need to maintain the system, would you like to have very highly detailed documentation about how it works, why the decisions were made, what's the behavior, what's the flow, flow data paths between here, architecture, how does it work, even visually, because that's how people like to think. If everybody would say, yeah, give it to me, right? The problem is how to get it done. So one of the insane powers that you now can do with LLMs is you can use it to document it. A simple example is take a Git diff and feed it to ChatGPT, and you get some amazing technical explanation of what just happened in that commit. And you can say, give me a business analysis of this, give me a technical analysis, give me a security analysis of this. And so we now can get to a point where we can really document effectively our code, and we can start to have a much bigger 3D view of our code, of our structures, of our environments, and we also can start to capture the meaning of it. So imagine how awesome it would be to be able to describe, here is what's happening in this cloud formation script, which, by the way, is completely unreadable beyond a certain point, right? Here's this Helm chart, here it is code commit, right? But here's the intent, or here's the intent of the changes you're making. Now think about how awesome it would be to go, whoa, hold on, the intent changed, and that's, suddenly something that will always go, or not always, but it would sometimes go under the radar because it was not obvious, that particular change of intent. And maybe this change of intent is not even in the second, third, fourth level, is on the fifth and the sixth, or maybe the interconnection between systems. All these things I just spoke for the last minute were absolutely impossible to do, require a huge amount of engineering time and money to do it, and actually nobody really done it properly, which is why we don't have it today in our workflows. But that all changes, because now we can really start to understand, and we can get ChatGPT to start explaining the materials of what's going on. And by the way, all this should be version controlled. So this is not about creating materials and stuff on the fly. This is like, we should be using and verifying the outputs. But the speed that you have and almost the experience is completely different. I now like to read the commits analysis created by ChatGPT of the code that I just commit. And I actually find it quite interesting because A, before I don't have to write it, B, because I'll go, oh yeah, I also changed that. Oh, I catch things and I can fix things quickly because, oh yeah, that's not really what happened. So you can get rid of that. But it's so much more effective and it becomes part of your commit workflow. So again, this is going to be massive. Threat modeling, listening to a Gary McGraw amazing, podcast the other day. And one of the things he said is that one of the problems we need to do is we need to scale threat modeling. We haven't figured out a way to scale threat modeling. And I completely agree. Threat modeling is an amazing practice. Done well, makes massive difference. It's a great way to communicate, great way to teach, great way to understand what's happening, great way to model threats, fundamentally what the name says, but we can never scale. And we can never scale because, how many of you guys done threat model where literally it starts by somebody saying, yeah, this is how my system works, right? They start to draw it. Think about how many degrees of failure we already are, because if you have to draw your architecture, means the architecture only lives in your head. Means there's no up-to-date environment that you're comfortable to actually represent what happens in the real world. We can now do something about it. So imagine not just threat modeling being used to create better materials, but then modeling the threats. And again, the other problem with threat modeling was the explosion of potential threats that had not a lot of context, which always reduced the value of the threat model. So we can now have context, we can have risks, we can have environments, we can have controls, and then we can say, okay, here's the model of what we have, here's the threats, but now apply the context. And suddenly you get a much smaller but highly focused and realistic set of threats and risks connected to that what you're analyzing. So very exciting about how we can now start to scale threat modeling using the GenAI stuff. And again, code reviews, right? Like I kind of covered already, but imagine a GenAI powered code review where you can also start to ask a lot more interesting questions and capture those questions and scale and start to talk with the bots about the intent. So I have some really interesting conversations with ChatGPT, and I have to say that the answers are amazing sometimes. And I have these full-on conversations. What about this? What about that? It's like having this co-pilot, right? This, literally this helper that has a lot of wide set of knowledge. Doesn't need to be all perfect. That's fine, but he really helps a lot, and he really augments it. And I think one of the last ones, instance response, right? Imagine an instance response world now driven by GenAI. There's a great session that was done yesterday about, a tool to recreate a lot of attack trees and basically possible scenarios based on the attack meter framework. Really cool stuff, right? But so again, on instance response, there's so many areas that we can start to have a good amount of context, so we can say what happened here, what's the problem, this, what's the signal, what's that, so we can really lower the noise that we've got, but increase dramatically the signals that we have here. And training is an area that I'm actually quite passionate about, and I do think that this could be one of the biggest game changer, which is we now will have the ability to create custom training materials that are adapted to an individual, to a particular culture, to a particular language, to a particular understanding, and we can create these personalized paths, which I feel was always the problem with the more traditional training. That had to be a lot more generic because there was a wider audience, but also the cost of customizing the training was always quite high. So if you look at some of the people that are talking about Gen AI in Africa and other developing countries and environments that, can basically, it's like actually what happened in Africa where they jumped from, phone lines to mobile, right? They almost skipped a generation, which can be sometimes quite good because then you don't have legacy. So, but not just that, I feel that even when we talk about skills transfer and bringing people from other industries into our industry, we now have the ability to create highly customized training packages, environments that you can talk to, you can ask things, you can go to ChatGPT and say, hey, I want to learn this, explain it to me, or give me a training plan, or ask me questions, or give me the almost like the ways to learn. And it's okay, you need to figure out the best way that you can learn or somebody can learn, but I feel that can scale a lot. And in cybersecurity, a lot of things that we do is training our teams, training others, educating, communicating. So I think this could be massive. Right, been talking for a while. There's just one more little topic I want to talk about. When I learn these things, I kind of like to basically be hands-on, and I like to be involved in sort of practical ways, because or else you just go on tangents, right? So one of the problems that we know is, how do you make board members understand cybersecurity? That's quite a common problem. We even have a session today, and there's common sessions about literally how do you communicate. And also board members want to know about cybersecurity, like, because they also know that in some ways they start to be accountable. So how do you make a board member understand and have a safe place for them to talk and engage and about cybersecurity? So playing around with this, so we kind of created the cyberboardroom.com, which you can go right now and create an account. It's free, right? Play around with it, and let me give you a quick demo. So if you go in there, right, it kind of looks like this. So there's some content in here that you can read, but the interesting thing is we actually created 3 bots, which I'll walk you in a bit. So the idea is these bots are the ones that provide advice and custom content to the board member, right? So what you can do here is you can say, so Athena is the one we called it, and say, hey, and I prompt the question here, say, good morning, what you do. So basically, this is the bot that is now saying, hey, look, I'm Athena, I'm an AI advisor created by the Cyber Board Room. My purpose to assist board members like you. So think about how cool it is, right? It already has context. It already knows that I'm a board member. It already knows that I care about security. It goes, okay, how can I assist you, right? So you can now say, okay, I'm on, let's say, the, finance industry, and I'm worried about, ransomware, right? So you can do that. And now this is the cool thing, right? So now I'm going to get context about it. I'm going to say, okay, ransomware attack can indeed have severe consequences, especially for organizations, blah, blah, blah. And then you can say, okay, give me some information about your environment. But you can even go, okay, actually before that, can you explain, ransomware for somebody, let's say like me, with limited, cybersecurity skills, but I have a strong financial, let's say, financial background, and have an MBA, right? So MBA, sorry, MBA, have a Master Business Administration, right? So you can see it. So now I can prime it and say, okay, can you explain this to me? And but I don't have a lot of cybersecurity skills, but then financial background. So what's going to happen now is going to basically, the bot provides information about that in that world in that language in a way starts being adapted to that particular context, and that's super critical. And and if, let's say, you just like bullet points, you say, can you explain it again only using bullet points, right? So basically this is where you now can be super creative, right? It's about the person on the other side, basically the individual that says, this is how I want to learn, this is the question I have, this is how I want to do it, and then you take it from there, right? So it's a pretty cool thing, so we're exploring with a lot of ideas in this. Again, please have a go, play with it. And okay, I'm going to try something, let's see if it works, right? Is you could also change it, the context of it, right? So you can say, hi, can you act like a very jaded cyber security professional, right? That is really tired of all the cyber security incidents, right? So you can modify the behavior of this, right? And actually, I think it's interesting because actually, I'll show in a second, the bot, because actually, okay, this didn't work. Actually, it's good it didn't work because we actually primed the bot to be helpful, an optimistic advisor. So there's some prompts. This is actually a good example of prompt injection. So good thing it didn't work, right? I'll show you an example in a second of that. So the thing that is super powerful here is that all that you saw there was created by this part here, right? And this is what's insane, right? So if you look at basically this, is that bot that you just saw there is basically powered by this small little bit where this is it's called the original prompt. So all the questions came after this. So you go, you help an advisor, you create by the boardroom, you're kind, and your job is to help. So you can see that's why I was saying don't be jaded, right? And then be proactive. So that's why you could see the bot was asking questions to clarify, and also give a nice message. And also we can then do things like this. So we also say, hey, you got two siblings. You got Odin, the tech bot. So we actually creating another bot to manage this, and Minerva, who's the business bot, supporting this stuff, right? And if you've seen Encanto, you get this joke. You also say, hey, there's also Bruno, right? But we don't talk about him. So in fact, even here, if I go back to the bot, right, and start again, and then saying, hi, hello, how are you? And I say, do you have siblings, right? What's cool about this is you can see this got created just from that small little thing I said. Like my first sibling, which is the tech bot behind capabilities, Odin, it helps me with up-to-date list of advances. The other is Minerva with the business support and commercial management. All this stuff, right? How do you, do you work together? So you can see that this is where ChatGPT is quite cool, right? Because it creates a nice narrative, creates a nice environment, and basically it's all based on the stuff that we provided. And if I go anybody else, right? Now it's going to go, actually, there's one more member of the family, Bruno, but we don't talk about it. He's still in development or actively involved in our conversation, right? So, but you can see that it's actually, I found it's really cool, right? Because you got this cool sense of humor, of implementation. And I want to show you one final little thing. So I wrote this nice, deep technical blog post about it, so you can read a lot of the details of how everything works. And I just want to show one little thing, which I actually find quite funny, right? Which is fundamentally this bit here, right? So if you go into, I'm sorry, let me just find it. Okay, so I make a little change, and I was actually speaking to a Portuguese friend, so we actually use Camões, which, by the way, I love to have ChatGPT at the time because I could really understand what the guy was all about. So I changed a little thing here to say, by the way, instead of being optimistic, you were highly sarcastic. Now, I actually found this answer really funny because if you look at the answer that it provides, it basically is like, hey, why should I care about cybersecurity? And the answer was, hey, good morning. Welcome back to another thrilling episode of Let's Try Not to Get Hacked Today. Starting, Camões, blah, 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 security the show everybody's talking about. Well, why should you care about cybersecurity? Where do I even start? The landscape of doom and gloom is so vast, right? Tell me, do you have any cybersecurity management in place? Firewalls, antivirus, regular audits, or maybe somebody who actually knows the phishing email looks like. So I find it's funny, right? So some individuals might actually like to be, to have this sort of more, kind of jaded or sarcastic approach, and others don't. Some might have like very dry, answers. I like Gary Goes a lot. Sister Michael. You can ask Sister Michael's version of cybersecurity, which again is super funny. So, the point here is you can adapt to the language and culture. And by the way, this it already speaks multilingual, right? Because if I go like this, oops, sorry. If I actually, you already answered, but let me go like this. If I say bom dia, right? I'm Portuguese, right? It already speaks Portuguese, right? And the answers are already in Portuguese, right? See? So it's really cool, right? So this already works in every language that ChatGPT supports, right? So again, insanely powerful. And that's fundamentally it, right? So I'm not sure if there's any questions in the chat, but that was sort of my view why the agents and what we really are looking in now in the medium term is a whole number of agents that augment the teams, that makes the teams a lot more productive, and really allows to take us to the next level. So it's not, again, just to reiterate, it's not about job losses, it's about job augmentation. It's about making us a lot more productive and be able to tackle issues that in the past were, pretty impossible or very hard or didn't scale. So cool. So any questions? If not, cool. Hey, Michael.
Hey, yeah. I had a question about inputs or lack of inputs. So when you're talking about threat modeling, one of the things I've noticed, particularly when you're dealing with people in the team who are more experienced at dealing with them versus less experienced at dealing with them, as you said, you're relying on being told what the system does and how it's put together. And generally, you find more experienced practitioner are better at finding what they're not being told, what's missing. So like the input. So would that be an example of, I guess, if you liken the GPT model back to individuals, about how much the person is pre-trained when they're doing it manually, and how effective we're going to be at using AI to generate those models based on incomplete information. So if we're not able to provide the full picture of it, but how accurate that is to come back.
Yeah, so I actually, I think there's a couple of ways to look at that. I really look at the models now as the initial prompt who sets the stage, almost reference information. So vector, people talk about vector things, but fundamentally is supporting information and then specific questions or specific data about it. And then the model, and the model sometimes became a bit of a commodity. So one angle in what you're talking about is we can already, if we have, for example, good reference implementations of what, for example, you're looking at. So it's a service, a micro web service or whatever. We can say, hey, here's what good looks like. This is the kind of stuff that we would like to see. Okay, let's do the analysis. But I think the sweet spot here is at the moment, it's not efficient to go to the individuals that have more experience to get them to help, because the onboarding process of getting to the point where those individuals are productive is too high. But so this is why we don't need the LLMs to produce 100% accurate information. What we need is for it to raise the quality and to accelerate the information. So an example is, let's say they have a more junior person back with an LLM on maybe some junior developers to do a threat model analysis, right? They can do that. I actually would argue that the LLM would already provide a lot of great guidance or great analysis, but then I could review it, right? You could review it. The senior architect could review it, and that's when they go, oh no, you missed this, you missed that, you missed this, because there's information. And then even better, I can then go, oh, okay, let me change the prompt. So next time you look for these other gotchas, right? So we can then learn the scalability, right? So, but even the architect, it's quite funny because what I used to do with the threat modeling is I would do threat models and go to the architects and going, is this correct? Right? Is this, and sometimes they'll go, well, that's not supposed to be like that. And go, yeah, that's actually how it works. On the other hand, they go, oh no, but you're missing this, or you're missing that. Or the developer will go, yeah, but there's a backdoor here because we couldn't make that work, so we created this. But that bit never scaled because when you wanted to go back and reflect it, it's almost like you create a work of art. So I feel that the key here is to still have the expert in the mix, but we scale a lot more. And then when the expert provides an opinion, you can recreate the materials. That's why the painting for me was such a paradigm shift. Because what happens is the expert goes, oh, that's not what it's supposed to be. Oh, that was not the intent. Or actually, you misinterpreted what we meant by this. But then you can go back and recreate it again super quickly and going, okay, does this mean, is this what you mean? Is this what you mean? I mean, and that's so much more effective than what we have today.
Yeah, I'm kind of thinking what are the other enrichments that you can augment onto that as well? So you kind of go, yes, we kind of pull it from what we know, but then also an ability to hook it up to your runtime. So if you want to say, well, I know that all of these resource groups have got the configuration, so pull that in, and then here are the code repositories, pull that in, and now start to do it. And then from all of those different things, build a more complete, accurate picture of everything.
Absolutely. I remember once did a security review that was one of the best ones I've done because they gave me access to an Elastic server that had the real-time logs. So I had the access to the application, I had the source code, I could trace to it, and I could see the logs. So the 3D view that I was starting to have was massive because like you can, even if you do a poke over here, you can see how far it would traverse, right? All the way to the database, all the way to the logs. Now I can see that, look, we can now feed the logs. Like I took in the TCP dump and then give it to ChatGPT and it gave me a great analysis, right? You can give now raw logs and say, analyze me this, or give me the content, or more interestingly, this represents this request. Start connecting the dots. So the context that you can have is you still need good data. So this is also going to drive us to create much better data sources, much better, those curated elements that we can then, give almost to a context engine that can then understand, that, and we can then ask questions about it. And that's what we never had before.
And taking just obviously like all of the different large language models which are available out there. I know as well there's like Open CRE as well, or there's other language models. How much of it do you think is going to move towards for security use cases that we need to pre-train models which are customized to security or can bring in more understanding of what that context is?
Yeah, well, I think Google actually has the SecPalm, right, which I think is quite interesting view of it. Yeah, I think there's definitely the interesting thing here is then as we go into more use case scenarios, you actually sometimes want smaller models, much more focused models, or models like have specific set of knowledge sets. Although one area that I don't fully understand yet is, for example, is it better to have something you train on a couple of things, or is it better to have really good vector embeddings that you can customize, that you can even use, models to help to create that you then feed a really good comprehension model? I mean, like, and I think there's an interesting debate here. I guess I think it's going to be interesting to see which one is more accurate, right? And some people talk, for example, the difference between long-term memory and short-term memory. It's almost like I think you can pre-train on intent and you can pre-train on almost like the behavior, but when you want accurate information, it's probably better to almost give it the information. Like, for example, is it more efficient to pre-train a model on NIST, the whole of NIST, or to have a way to feed the elements of NIST and maybe the context window needing to be a certain size, but then the answers that you get are actually completely accurate, right, to that particular, let's say, NIST framework.
Okay, that's like referencing the information that you want to provide into it and providing it in the prompt at the time. So like, as you say, the example of what good looks like, just go like in the prompt, here is what I want it to look like, or here's an example of what we think is good, and then use that as the basis to build upon.
Correct. Look, we had a really fun example in my team, right, where we were releasing a particular product, and the product required a bunch of steps, right, from setup kit, do this, get a Jira token, etc. And what happened was we actually used ChatGPT to go, hey, give me the detailed instructions for this, which is actually really cool, right? Like how to do this. So instead of you Googling how to set up my SSH key, we go, okay, here's the thing. In fact, here's the name of the repo, here's the stuff. So even the instructions were already all nice, right? So we do that, we share that with the team, and I kid you not, a dev comes along and goes, guys, I got it, it's all working, but I didn't install my Jira key, right? And I literally, my first instinct was like, dude, you mean step 3 of the 7 instructions? But then I realized, of course, the first couple of steps were irrelevant because he had it. By then, your brain stops reading, right? And what we then do is we say, hey, what about this? So we then say, the prompt was, you are a helpful assistant. He is the raw content, like he is literally the guidance, and then say, ask some questions to the user, right? So then ChatGPT was clever enough to analyze that and figure out what was the 7 questions you want to ask. And then you answer those questions, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, right? And then you get technical, 100% relevant guidance to whatever that user was. So you don't have instructions 1 to 7 general, you have instructions 1 to 3 that start where the user's knowledge or the user experience ended, right? That makes the whole difference. So suddenly, of course, he's going to read it because he's going to go step 1, which I haven't done, and blah, 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 right?
Yeah.
And the key is that we fed it the document, right? We fed it in a way the guidance, which is why context windows matter. So you got 24 now here, you got on ChatGPT 42, I think, or 24K, but then, what's it called? Claude 2 has 100K. So this now becomes an interesting question of cost even, because I've seen cases where 3.5 ChatGPT is as good than 4.0 if you feed it the data. So maybe there's an early version that is even cheaper, right? So we don't need to use the super powered one, right, to perform an action that actually a much lighter, maybe even faster and cheaper language model can run.
Yeah. Because we've been using it for, well, not in anger, but using it to, like, going back to one of the earlier points around creating content for different personas, as in take these requirements and turn it into stories that engineers or product owners can pick up and play.
Yeah.
So about using the translation between, well, as a security team, this is what we mean, but let's write it an example of
That's
something
cool.
actionable for teams
So
to pick up
how
and
did you
play
wire it
with.
up? You put it like a chat bot, or it's just a prompt, or how?
Just going into, I actually like tested a bunch of different models to go like, well, if we go into OpenAI or ChatGPT 3.5 or 4, and then going into Bard or different models and going, if I provide this requirement in the same way, what does the story look like which has come out of it? So just saying like, this is the format of how we want a story to be written. This is the, as an example, like a PCI requirement for network security. So you might go for implementing PCI requirement 1. Blah, and then going into, and this is the building blocks or the components that we want to use. So we want to use visual firewall, or we want to use this or that. So basically give a picture of where to apply it, and then go, now write me a story for implementing that. Like one I was playing around with was implement customer managed keys for implementing encryption for data at rest at service bus. And show me what that would look like in terms of an instruction that we can pick up and say, right, so speak to an engineering team and say, that's basically sort of what we want you to build, but use it as the starting point. Obviously, don't just trust it implicitly, but go, is that kind of what we want to create? So rather than having to have somebody sit down and write all of that from scratch, we'll just kind of bang it in, see what comes out, finesse it, make it relevant, fix it, and then hand it over.
But it was insanely more productive.
A lot faster, yeah.
And the cool thing is that when you want to do tweaks, and this is my key point with generative, when you want to do tweaks, you're now you're tweaking the final product, right? And the cost of recreating that is very low. Where in the past, even if you did the first pass, then you will you almost spend 20% or 5% of your time making the first pass, and then the other 80 to 95% of the time just trying to get it in that better state.
Yeah, mostly PowerPoint slides. That's the thing. Every time you decide that you've kind of gone in too big or too small on PowerPoint, you're like, all right, I need to make everything smaller. You need to move every single box into that. So,
by the way, have you started playing with a new visual AI, with ChatGPT, right? It's pretty cool, right? So you can now upload pictures. So you can now do your drawing on a board and then take it to ChatGPT, and it starts to not just analyze it. You can transcribe it. You can give you, other, dot implementations of it. It's really freaking cool. That's going to be a massive game changer.
Not done it yet, but need to check it out.
Yeah. Cool, man. No, thanks for the questions. I hope you
Thank
found
you.
the content quite interesting. And I see you in other sessions of the summit.
Thanks.